Hi, this is Roger Peterson and welcome to my Costa Rica Law channel where I cover everything related to moving, living, retiring, or investing in Costa Rica and doing it the right way to ensure that you stay out of trouble. Now, we are currently in the midst of a real estate surge, mostly fueled by U.S. citizens looking to move to the coastal areas of Costa Rica. So for those of you considering purchasing real estate, in this video, I'm going to break down the real estate closing cost that you're going to encounter purchasing property in Costa Rica. That way you know the costs associated with your real estate purchase so you can use that information as part of your negotiations on the property that you're considering. Now, the most expensive part of the real estate transaction is going to be that portion of the closing costs that are related to the transfer of title from the seller to the buyer. These fees are all set by law and are based on a sliding fee schedule based on the actual value of the transaction. So let's break it down for you. And then at the end, I'm going to walk you through an actual example of a real estate transaction and go ahead and calculate all the closing costs for you so you can see how it works in reality with this example. Okay, the first item on the closing menu is going to be the national government transfer tax, and that is 1.5% of the value of the transaction. Now, every single real estate transfer in Costa Rica will pay this tax. All these funds go to the national government. The second item is the National Registry Recording Office fee. In Costa Rica, we have a centralized national property title registry. This is centralized in the capital city of San Jose with regional office throughout the country. So you may be used to more localized recording offices, but in Costa Rica, it's one centralized registry. It is called the Registro Nacional, and it collects a fee of 0.5% of the value of each real estate title deed that it records in that registry. The next section consists of documentary stamps, which are payable to different government agencies as follows. The first one is an agrarian stamp. This fund goes to the Institute for Rural Development of Costa Rica. Then we have a fiscal stamp. This is a tax that's imposed on contracts such as real estate purchase contracts, and in this case it funds the national government. This tax dates back to the creation of the fiscal code back in 1885 and no signs of them letting it go. Next, we have the municipal stamp. The municipal is your local government. So this tax is collected by the local government where your property is located. After that, we pay the Costa Rican Attorney Bar Association stamp. And this is a tax that is paid for any legal related transaction in Costa Rica, and the funds go directly to the Costa Rican Attorney Bar Association. Then finally, we have the National Archives stamp duty. And this was originally passed in order to build the National Archives building in San Jose. However, the tax remains, even though the building was built, and the funds now go to support the operations of the National Archives, which houses all the government records. So when we add up all the documentary stamps, we're looking at about 0.37% of the value of the transaction. So all the preceding are really taxes which are paid to the government agencies. The final component of the closing costs is going to be the notary transaction fee. Now, by law, only a Costa Rican notary public can draft and record property transfer deeds in the National Registry. As such, there's a fee to use the services of the notary public, which is also based on a sliding fee schedule based on the amount of the transaction. For a rough calculation, you can estimate around 1.2% to cover the notary transaction fee. Now keep in mind, these are the minimums set by the Costa Rican Bar Association. So the notary could charge more than that depending on the complexity of the transaction and what's involved in that particular transaction. So always be sure to get a closing estimate up front so you know exactly what you're going to pay. In Costa Rica, to be a notary public, you also have to be an attorney. As such, in practice, what you're going to find is that your real estate closing attorney that you've hired to oversee your transaction will also likely be the licensed notary public that's going to represent you during the closing transaction and record the title deed in the National Recording Office for you. In addition to the notary fee, the notary public that is handling the transaction is going to have to add a value-added tax, VAT tax, which is charged on all services provided in Costa Rica. and that tax is 13% of the notary fee that is charged. So let's pull all this together. Let's assume we have a house transaction for $300,000, and let's run through the closing costs for that transaction. Now, to make it easier, I've added a closing cost calculator on my website. So if you go to CostaRicaLaw.com, on the left-hand corner, I've got a closing cost calculator for you. And I'm going to go ahead and include a link in the video description as well. Okay, so here we are on the website. Let's scroll down on the calculator and let's enter the amount of $300,000 in this section here. And then we click enter. And the calculator is going to give you the full breakdown that we just discussed. So let's look at these specifically. So we have the transfer tax. In this case, it's going to be $4,558.25. The National Registry Recording that we discussed, $1,519.42. And then the sum of all the stamps that we talked about. Remember, we got the Bar Association, Agrarian Stamp, Fiscal Stamp, Municipal Stamp, National Archive Stamp. That's going to give us a total here of $1,108.34. So now if we have the subtotal of the three components in the registration, we have $7,186.01. And to that now we add the notary transaction fee for this transaction, again based on $300,000. It's $3,284.13. We add the sales tax, VAT, 13% to the notary fee. And now we have a total closing for a $300,000 transaction. The total costs are going to be $10,945.68 to transfer that title from the seller over to the buyer. If you wanted to do a quick estimate of closing costs, you could use 4% as that number, and that will give you some margin. Because another factor that plays into the calculation is the exchange rate between the dollar and the Costa Rican colon currency. In dollar-denominated transactions, the government generally multiplies it by the higher exchange rate. But then when you turn around to pay for the tax in dollars, they will receive them at the lower rate. That is why on my closing cost calculator, you're going to see a dollar to colon buy and sell exchange rate. Now, the question is, who pays these closing costs? There is no hard set rule, and the parties will often negotiate these. Generally, locals will expect the buyer to pay all the closing costs. In expat transactions, they will sometimes negotiate to split equally the transfer tax and the documentary stamps, and then the buyer will assume the cost of the notary transaction fee. Now, if you have any financing involved where the seller is financing some of the transaction for you, then expect additional costs related to forming a mortgage in favor of the seller. And in these cases, those additional costs are going to be paid by the buyer. This covers the closing cost part related to the transfer of title. However, there are going to be additional components that you need to consider as well. So before you actually get to the closing, where you're sitting down with the buyer and seller and the closing attorney, you should have negotiated first a real estate purchase agreement with the seller. This is a very important document because it guides the entire transaction all the way to closing. So these agreements are generally drafted by the real estate closing attorney and are charged separately from the closing costs. The cost is going to vary depending on the complexity and the value of the transaction. Generally, once you have details about the scope of the transaction that you're getting engaged into, then the closing attorney that you hire to represent your interests can give you an upfront cost estimate for drafting that purchase agreement. Now, the same is going to apply for the cost of due diligence to review the property. Now, for a standard titled condo or residential home, now the amount of due diligence that's going to be required, of course, is going to be much less than, let's say, you're looking at property for a residential real estate development, you're looking at rural farmland, or you're looking at beach property. Those may require more extensive due diligence. But here, the most important determination that you need to make is, what is your objectives in purchasing this property? That way, your closing attorney can tailor the due diligence to ensure that your objectives are going to be met. Once that is done, they can quote you specifically for the cost of doing the due diligence for that purchase, all fully aligned with your objectives. Another cost component that you need to consider is the cost of escrow. Now, in Costa Rica, we have several companies that offer escrow services. And these prices can range from $1,000 to $2,000 depending on the amount of the transaction. So to wrap it all up, when you purchase real estate in Costa Rica, you're going to need to take into account the following steps and procedures involved in the process. Number 1, drafting that purchase agreement. Number 2, the amount of due diligence that you're going to require. 3, the cost of escrow. And 4, the real estate property transfer costs. Well, I hope this video guides you through a smooth real estate transaction closing process in Costa Rica. And as always, thank you for watching the video. Be sure to subscribe, and if you have any questions or comments, let me know.